The Squig and the Light. This may sound like the kind of a book that a very enthusiastic, shirt well ironed type of door knocker would try to convert you with. But it is quite the opposite. A squig would rather be something that you let loose at unwanted deity salespeople, whilst relishing the resulting ankle damage scene that most certainly will take place on your doorstep. The squig, a constant companion to what we call GreenSkin orcs and goblins and that, have been around for some time. Herded as cattle and apparently thus a nourishing food source, but are mainly known for being a ferocious, unmanageable lump of muscle with lots of teeth. Bouncy cows with teeth, perhaps. Today, well, not your today, but the today of this video release is Squig Day. See, these creatures seem to be forever in the hearts of many, and have now bitten their way into mine as well. Squig Day, initiated by YouTuber friends, is about spreading squig love within our hobby, and I could not resist joining in. This entire phenomenon is for me a symbol on how heartwarming and simply sincere our hobby can be. That a specific type of miniature can be loved. That a sculpt, the idea of a character, and the reverence towards this can be what inspires people not only to paint, but lead to creating something quite profound. The breathing of life and soul into the empty plastic shells of our miniatures. Also, this whole spectacle gave me the perfect excuse to get to paint a miniature that has leaped across my retina many a time. The Cromlech Gnaw. A Gnaw, you ask? Well, squigs come in many shapes and sizes, some larger than one of them handbag dogs, others small enough for a miniature goblin to herd, but they are also the intellectual property of tabletop game and miniatures mogul Games Workshop. Thus my Gnaw cannot be a squig. I totally understand that companies need to protect their investments, but I think we should all be very grateful that we don't have to pay the Tolkien estate a piece of silver every time we use the word orc, or have to sacrifice our pet at the grave of some ancient Norse storyteller every time we use the word elf. And this is where the light comes in. I now have a squig, Gnaw to paint. It's perfectly futuristic, with armor, cyborg eyes, a green skin on top that I guess desperately tries to aim the scrap cannon in the right direction while the Gnaw is running in the opposite. I wanted to withstand the urge of super colourful, going for a dystopian realism, grim dark, I don't know, squid dark, perhaps. What I wanted most was to get the light right. To really work on the feeling that this thing is alive, on a battlefield. Getting the highlights and shadows right on all the different textures and surfaces, it has been an obsession of mine. Getting the light right, painting the light right. And so what does that mean to me? Well, I imagine that our small plastic friends are on a battlefield. There is a sky of sorts. Could be a sky similar to the ones we know, or something more alien. But the light comes from above. This is how we're used to seeing things. Even indoors, most commonly, we hang lights from the ceiling, and not the other way around. This, translated to a miniature, means that any surface pointing up should be more well lit. Something that I practice with almost every miniature I paint. But I feel that I have not taken it far enough. I usually shade the darkest parts with a darker version of the base color, but I almost never go all the way to black. Same for highlights. They quite rarely go all the way to white. I also get lost along the way, highlighting areas that should most probably be in shade, just because I don't feel I can leave them unhighlighted. My go-to start with all of this is Xenothor Highlighting, dusting a black base-coated miniature with a white from up top and around at about a 45-degree angle. And this is what I did, resisting the urge to wander further down, and really locking my airbrush to only dust from up top. If areas are black, so be it. I was now going to translate this Xenothor Prime and enforce it. Starting with the Gnaw skin, going for a lizard meets worm, I started sketching out the transitions from the black to the darkest shades of the skin. And then doing the same with the highlights, leaving the transitions in between relatively untouched. I'm doing a lot of strokes and sort of straight lines, trying to build up a texture that hopefully will leave me with something that looks more like skin than a smooth blended surface. Then, with both the shadows and highlights now on the wet palette, I could start working on the transitions. Sticking to the straight line brush strokes thing, making sure to follow the Xenothor Prime guide, but also trying to make the skin just look like skin. To help blend the transitions between light and dark, but also adding a bit more color, I watered down a cold green heavily and glazed, quote unquote, some of the darker skin tones, the ones facing down. This is another thing with natural light. Shaded areas tend to be cooler. And because that's the way things are in real life, our eyes seem to think this is a very pleasing effect. I could now move on to highlighting the skin, still sticking to the straight stabbing lines, but using a bit of a different color to get even more tones into the skin, working my way up to an almost white when needed. Then glazing on a sort of pink on some of the highlighted parts to blow a bit of life into everything and to make it look just that little bit more cuddly. And finally finishing off with some careful, pure but diluted white highlights, trying to exaggerate this feeling of stretchy, foldy, wormy, wobbly skin. And then Jabba the Hutt vibes sort of came to mind, especially since my last project was still on the table. Golden bra versus squiggly tail gave me a relatively unpleasant mental image of this Gnaw licking its lips when looking at the little crab lady. And so later on I deliberately gave it a blue tongue to sort of try and vanquish some of the dirty old Jabba vibes. I moved on to the armor, going for a feeling of tank. Only I didn't want this to be fully as textured as the skin, so I started with sort of a smoother wet blend, and then adding a bit of personality and scratches and stuff like that later on when highlighting. While doing all of this, I mentioned Squig Day to my patrons on our Discord channel. Sort of, do you want to join in and paint a squig just for the fun of it kind of a thing? Once more, I was kind of overwhelmed by the love for squigs. And once more, reminded of the awesomeness of this community. Not only did squigs of different shapes and sizes get painted, crafted, kit-bashed, they were even sent by post to those that were without. Mailmen going mysteriously missing as a result, but once more proving that there are a lot of wonderful and including people in this hobby. That even though there are all these nice sculpted miniatures around and all the tools and all these things we can buy, the by far biggest thing in this hobby is the community and the wonderful people brought together. And I'm very grateful to have some of them as patrons and subscribers to these videos. Now, I had a wet blend that looked relatively identical to the Xenothor Prime. You might ask yourself, what's the point of that? And I'm not totally sure, only that I'm kind of proud of pulling it off. But I was now getting into smaller areas that I was not quite sure of how to paint while keeping this sense of light, just because of the mere small size. I decided to go for a more traditional approach to the yellow, doing a covering layer of yellowish that I then darkened down with the brown wash. The brown acts both sort of as a shadow and a dirty kind of a feeling. And then I only highlighted the areas where, according to my Xenothor Prime, things were supposed to be brighter. I then used some yellow ink on the highlighted parts. This made them look sort of more sun-touched, warmer, and the non-highlighted parts started to look more like shadow, just because they were more dull. I painted a lot of things on this mini. It's got a lot of bits. But I'm going to try and limit this story to the different approaches I had to working with light and shadows and highlights. The most difficult thing by far was leaving black areas black. Once I start to paint, I want to sort of smear color everywhere, and I want to highlight everything. Just covering the entire underside of this miniature with black paint felt strange. Time-saving, I must admit. Blending in black into shadows to make them almost black felt kind of drastic. Highlighting with a pure, although diluted white felt drastic too. But in the end, this all gave me a sense of dramatics that I don't think I've managed to achieve before. The Xenothor guide represents how the light falls on all the different surfaces on the miniature. Now, depending on the surface, like I mentioned earlier, that surface might be something we want darker or duller. Like I painted some rusty bits. These rusty bits, they're supposed to be darker and duller. Highlighting them with something like a white would make them look shiny, not rusty. Yeah, another video kind of a thing. But what if we want to paint certain effects onto a surface, like scratches and dirt? If the sculpt itself has a scratch, that would probably be darker in the recesses of the scratch. But if I wanted to paint some on, I'd have to leave the Xenothor guide. And that's what I did. I left the thoughts of Xenothor Prime behind and just started working on cosmetics. Doing extra scratches and texture on all the bits I found just too boring. Also adding oily streaks and stains to the entire robotic arm thing. I mean, I don't think these greenskins care all too much about polishing and taking super care of all their gear, but I mean, engine parts need oiling, or things might, stall and you might lose the battle. And losing battles is not something green things appreciate, I think. Thus, a lot of oil goes on the mechanical bits. And then finally some rust on the entirety of the thing. Oiling mechanic bits is fine, according to greenskins, but rust is inevitable. I mean, just imagine trying to climb around on this thing to polish the armor. I would personally be pretty scared of getting tossed off and then eaten. Rust is to prefer to one's ankles being intact, I believe. I used an oil wash for this. It just flows out so beautifully and effortlessly. And then the Squig, the Gnaw, was done. But the video's not. Because while we're on the subject of light, what about painting light that actually isn't coming from the sky? Like light coming from a lamp or something. This can go by the name OSL, Object Source Lighting. I'm no expert, and that's just why I want to do more of it. I have this little lamp thing on the base. As you can see, I gave it a burst with the airbrush when I was doing the Xenothor Prime. This little burst is a great place to start because it will guide me in the same way as the rest of the Xenothor Prime did with the sky bit. If I wouldn't have had an airbrush, that would have been fine too, just requiring a little bit more thinking and maybe just a slight headache. I painted up the rest of the base, leaving the place I wanted to be lit by my red-pinkish lamp, and then started by choosing out the absolute darkest color of my light. A red, purpley, brownish color. This color represents the furthest reach of the lamp. I'm then going to work in brighter and brighter colors, closer and closer to the light source. I desperately try to avoid painting anything out of habit, instead looking at the lamp from sort of different angles, only painting the areas that are in line of sight of the lamp. Once the light reflections are done, the lamp needs to be quite a bit brighter. And instead of using the warmer sort of skin tone I've been using to highlight the pink for the reflections, I mix the actual light bulb highlight with the white, making the lamp itself just really pop. After cleaning up a bit of unwanted sort of paint spillage, everything is looking pretty lamp glowy. This is how I've been painting all my light sources as of late. I painted a small lamp in the cockpit in a similar manner, going from a bluey green to a warm yellow green. It worked quite well for these Stormcast folk as well. The big thing is figuring out a shade that will work and look like a darker version of the brighter source. Finally, I did a similar kind of a thing on the cyborgerly goggles, only here I wasn't after a glow as much. Instead, I tried to have in mind the reflections that would probably sort of flash across the glass surface, mainly focusing on highlighting the upper parts of the glass, seeing as that is where the reflections from the sky would be, but doing it all in a sort of scratched glass manner. And then the Gnaw was done. I really enjoy how this all turned out. I'm no longer getting any Jabba vibes, but if there is a big thing I'm going to take away, apart from the fact that squigs are awesome, is to not be afraid of dramatics when painting. Using black shadows and brighter highlights, but also textures. This video was supposed to be about light in the squig, but the thing that I'm most pleased with is all the different textures I managed to get going on this fabulous miniature. Now, I wish you a happy Squig Day, and if said day has passed, prepare for the next. Your life will most certainly level up if you bring a squig into it.